So yeah, The Hobbit. Yeah, I'm not that big into Lord of the Rings, to be honest. That's just the truth. I've never read any of the books, and as a kid I was somewhat interested when the films were first coming out, but I got bored while watching Twin Towers and I didn't really see Return of the King in theaters, so going into this, I'm not really viewing this from the viewpoint of someone who's really looked forward to this film. I mean, it's cool that, hey, it's The Hobbit, the prequel to Lord of the Rings, and I was somewhat curious as during the whole time where they were initially wanting Guillermo del Toro to direct, with everybody, like everybody and their mother coming out and saying, oh, we want Peter Jackson to direct because he directed the previous Lord of the Rings film. So, I mean, I was a little bit hyped, mostly out of curiosity, but I'm not a die-hard high fantasy type. That's just the truth of it. With that said, let's get started with this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. Now let me begin by saying the opinions in this are based on the 24 frames per second 2D showing, because the theater I went to did not have the 48 frames per second 3D showing, and when it came to the 3D showings, I'm a total cheapskate. I'm not going to pay an extra $2 to see something in 3D. I mean, given how people still are struggling with the technologies to this day, I'm not saying that that's going to necessarily be the case with this film, because I can't say for certain, but that's just it. So these opinions are based on the 2D 24 FPS version of the film. With that said, however, there are some moments in the film, at least when I was watching it, where you can definitely see some frame blending going on. Now, frame blending is where you shoot footage at a higher frame rate, and then you're converting it down to a much lower frame rate, and you're essentially squishing a lot of frames together. That's the best way I can describe it, and that's pretty much what I saw in, well, two major shots in the film. Both were like very sweeping vista shots. The first is in the opening prologue where you're seeing the kingdom of Erebor in all its glory. Things get very stroby and choppy as they're kind of trying to pan through these things slowly but still quickly, in the sense that you're trying, like, almost like you're flying through this vista. And that was one major thing, that in really any of the shots that were meant to pander to the 3D gimmick was where I saw a lot of the frame blending starting to show through. Basically, they were like parts that weren't really converted to 24 frames per second very well. Another technical hiccup I noticed, and this may be at the fault of the theater because of where I was sitting, because of the sound setup, but what kept happening in the prologue and in really any part where there was one character narrating over events that happened in a different place apart from the main story, the music overpowered parts of the voiceover. That was something that I noticed. I mean, once or twice I could kind of, well, it happened twice, but it seemed a little too coincidental, so it could either be the theater or someone just forgot to check that part of the sound mixing. But what would happen is that the music and the sound effects would overpower parts of the voiceover, making it so that you couldn't really tell what they were saying. I mean, you got most of the key information, but then there were some parts where it was just like, and then da-da-da, because there was like either explosions or battles or the music going on to the point where I'm just like, what did he say? Huh? I didn't catch that. And in the theater, you can't necessarily tell the projectionist to back it up to see what they said. So yeah, that was the other major technical hiccup that I noticed. It was basically the frame blending issues with the 3D pandering shots and the, well, issues with the sound mixing, particularly in the two scenes where there are major narrations over, well, major battles. Technical hiccups aside, this film is still really well put together. I mean, the overall production design, the overall mise-en-scène has that classic Lord of the Rings style that we've come to know and love from the Lord of the Rings films. So, visual aesthetics, visually it looks really good. It has some really nice shots. The production design, it looks really cool. And it's also really well acted. You've got a lot of the actors from the Lord of the Rings films coming back. Even Elijah Wood, who played Frodo, you've even got him coming back in the film. So the film is also really well acted. There's some really well written dialogue. It's well paced. It is on the long side though, because it's a Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings film. It's kind of a case of, you know what you're getting into when you're going to see this film. So overall, this film is incredible. It's got stunning visuals, got endearing characters, well-written dialogue, good acting. It's a bit on the long side, but unlike the Lord of the Rings films, this one has an easier time keeping you engaged. And from what people have told me about the novel, it's definitely a lot more lighthearted and a lot more accessible than the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because from some of the backstory I've heard is that J.R.R. Tolkien initially wrote The Hobbit for his kids. I may be wrong, but that's just based on information that I know, and that really kind of shows in this film as opposed to the Lord of the Rings films, which are considerably a lot darker. There are some dark moments and some pretty genuinely creepy moments in this film, but it's just got a more accessible feel to it, and given that it's a prequel, well, that kind of makes sense. It takes place before any major events have happened, but it still has the things where it links to, hey, this is stuff that was important in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And they even do that with just certain musical cues, like when Bilbo finds the ring, as well as certain characters make an appearance. I don't quite remember their names, mainly the elves people, as well as Gollum / Smeagol, although he's just called Gollum in this one because, well, he hasn't met Frodo yet. So, point being, this film, really good, and it obviously sets itself up for continuation because it ends on a cliffhanger, ends at essentially a halfway point, since that's become the new trend now. But in the case of Tolkien's books, it actually makes the most sense to break it up into multiple parts because of how long the books are. I mean, if they tried to adapt the whole book in one movie, I would have been there for about 5 hours. I'm just saying. So, to summarize, it's got good visuals, good writing, good acting, good production design. The only problems is that with the 2D version, there are some frame blending issues in the certain shots that are meant to pander to the 3D gimmick, whether it's having stuff in the foreground or like huge sweeping vistas that are supposed to be moving really quickly, like whether they're following certain characters that are in a very tense chase scene, or like in that opening scene when you're seeing in the Kingdom of Erebor and basically trying to move through quickly while still showing you the oohs and ahs of it. Those are the only major like cinematographical issues that I saw, where there was the issues of frame blending, and the sound issues may be attributed to where I was sitting in the theater because of how they had their speakers set up, but I could be wrong. It could be in the film itself, because this is the same thing that happened when I watched The Dark Knight Rises. So, on my personal scale, I'm giving The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey a 4.5 out of 5. Like I said, the frame blending issues and the sound issues were kind of detractions, but I still enjoyed the film overall. So that's it for this week's episode of Ronnie's Reviews. It's incredibly on the short side because there wasn't really much else to really say about it. I mean, aside from the 2 major technical hiccups, everything else is pretty much as you would expect from a Peter Jackson fantasy film. And that's pretty much it about that. So, yeah, I'm going to be taking another break next week because looking at the releases coming out next week, nothing really seems interesting, and, well, the paper's not running, and I've kind of got to take it easy on spending money on movie tickets. So yeah, taking a break next week, but the week after that, we'll be getting a review of Les Miserables. See ya then.